It's rarer than I would like to have situations where I go on the ground and get information and be able to talk about it knowing that I've been there, that I've done something. There's a little bit of staying at home and just working on different screens that's very compelling to me. I like having a control panel of all different terminals and web pages showing me what my processes are doing. But in many ways, that never beats going down and getting the story. That just happened because I was able to get a little bit more information about the fate of the Living Computer Museum in Seattle. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. The Living Computer Museum was an idea that came out of Paul Allen, a co-founder of Microsoft and a billionaire way too many times over, who used his money in various ways, but notably for here, opened up a variety of locations and places in the Seattle area that were, well, for the moment, let's call them museums. A science fiction museum, a movie theater that functioned for showing old movies, and the Living Computer Museum. The Living Computer Museum worked off a number of personal mainframes that Paul Allen owned that took a lot of money to restore, and then, in a fit of hubris, he had connected them to the internet. So you could request an account on an old mainframe, log into it from the internet, and use it. From this grew a larger and larger collection of machines, mainframes, mini-computers, microcomputers, and related materials. People were donating their collections, and the Living Computer Museum looked forward to a long and happy life, being able to provide both a look back at what had been there and an ongoing part in preserving and presenting computer history. As it stood, I was very lucky. I knew people who were working at the Living Computer Museum, and I visited it, I would say 3 or 4 times over the years. I took long tours there. I attended events there. I was able to even speak there. I got to see it both from the point of view of a patron and from the point of view of a staff member, going through various elevators to rooms full of machines being classified. And like many others who walked through, I was impressed with how they were going for a combination learning museum and computer lab, and I really looked forward to it being one of the foundational ways that people would experience computer history. However, Paul Allen, who had experienced various scares, even from the 1980s, involving cancer, eventually fell to it. And in 2020, the Living Computer Museum was shut down and never returned. Not really. In the years after its temporary closure, there were the usual rumors, considerations, predictions, but what it all came down to, and what I have learned, is that it is not coming back. There came the announcement of an auction at Christie's of parts of Paul Allen's personal collection. Letters, artifacts, and computers, including computers from the Living Computer Museum. Naturally, the retro community did what it does best, completely panic, try to figure out what's happening, and mostly rant at the stars about how life goes wrong. As details dripped out from the initial announcements and articles, I wanted to know exactly what was going on and if there was anything at all, I could do to help. Years before, when I was shutting down the Information Cube, my storage unit, I looked at the Living Computer Museum as one of the destinations for materials that I was transferring to other institutions. I had a wonderful chat with one of the curators of LCM, and I ultimately decided not to send things there, mostly because I had other closer groups that I could give things to immediately. But that said, I really believed in what they were up to. I believed that you couldn't just have machines sitting on a shelf, that if they weren't in some way functional, if people didn't see them being used, they had about as much meaning as a pile of metal sitting inside of a farm museum, just tools stacked on top of one another with no idea about how a person made use of them. I really did, in every way, buy in to the belief. When the word came down that Christie's was going to auction parts, it also came with an announcement that they were going to show off some of the materials at an event in New York City. I live near New York City, so I made it a point on the fourth day of their event to drive down, park illegally, and walk into the front door of Christie's looking for this collection. I was able to find it pretty quickly. There was a huge plaque talking about Paul Allen, and right there in the lobby were a set of machines, a Pac-Man machine, an Engelbart mouse, an Apple I, an Alto, all sorts of artifacts you would expect to find if you were being told that computer artifacts of a huge and valuable nature were going to be somewhere. I took pictures, I listened to people talking about them, and to my great pleasure, I bumped into a couple people that I knew, including Stephen Jones. Now, Stephen Jones and I go back 20-plus years. He is a member of SDF.org, which is, let's just say, a combination of a retro and vintage computing group and an ongoing computer community. I interviewed him for the BBS documentary, and he makes an appearance in a couple of the episodes. I thought he was a fascinating figure with a really amazing aesthetic for his home, and his love of the look and feel of computers was in many ways contagious for me. He also was the first person I ever met who had a DeLorean and let me sit in it, which was a really nice memory from the production. So, here was Stephen standing next to me in New York, and I talked to him about the future, the past, and everything that could be done about the Living Computer Museum's next chapter. Here, with a caveat that I am paraphrasing, is what we ended up discussing. The most shocking thing to me, which may be to others, is that the Living Computer Museum, well, it was never quite a museum in the standard sense. It was not a nonprofit. It was not separate from any of the other Paul Allen ventures. It was not in any way truly designed to be sustainable. It was, in fact, an extension of Paul Allen's collections. Think of it, if you will, of a garage that is full of cars in the house of a billionaire, where there's a separate entrance and a staff that takes care of the cars. But there's still the billionaire. It's their place. You're visiting their property. And if you decide to donate a couple file cabinets of car documentation, they'll accept it, they'll take it, they have the space. But it's not quite the same as donating it to other institutions. The idea of working with all of these different computers was very, very attractive. But that building, that endeavor, the paychecks, were all part of the Paul Allen enterprise, whose name has changed over the years, but is known to most as Vulcan. Vulcan was, and is, as of now, the entity that controlled all of Paul Allen's different interests, his yacht, his science fiction museum, his ownership of a sports team. This was all his world. We were just the ants living among it. Living Computer Museum was a money loser, a major money loser, millions of dollars a year. Could somebody of competence and direction and focusing on potential ways to deal with it reduce that cost? Probably would have happened. There were apparently sketched plans to make it separate, but they never came to fruition. I found all this out and I was completely floored. I was so used to dealing with institutions that were independent, focused on computers either directly or indirectly, and knowing that they had some level of sustainability planned. I mean, you can never truly plan for every contingency. Fire, finances, laws can change how a place survives. But to know that everything was relying on the heartbeat of one person, a person who had known that he had chronic health issues that would occasionally crop up and cause great consternation, I wasn't prepared for that. Here, I think I kind of split differently with other people, and the debate is well worth it. If somebody does something good, if somebody does a mitzvah, but there are other ways to do that mitzvah that are, in fact, better, more sustainable, more understanding of a world beyond yourself, did they do bad? Is a choice made that could have been better a bad choice, or is it simply a good choice that could have been better? I think that debate falls to the wayside when we get to the end game, the moment that matters. When I was working on my information cube, there were materials of all different sorts taken from other collections, and that included a whole set of vintage consoles that were gifted to me by a friend, Delchai. And I held on to them for a long, long time. But I wasn't doing anything with them. I wasn't setting them up. I wasn't looking at them in any meaningful way. I was just storing them until later. And with the shutdown of the information cube, I looked around for an entity that would take them and perhaps do something with them. And the entity I chose was the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment, a group that I had actually seen the founding of, that my friend Alex Handy had set up. And so I ended up mailing all of my consoles that had been gifted to me to Alex Handy and the Maid, where they exist to this day. The Maid has gone through a location change. They have gone through a storage change. I like their new location, and I loved their old one. In both cases, I could walk among them and know that the amount of material that Delchai had given me was now in a museum and being played or being understood as part of a history that kids could learn while they played video games at the Maid. That's a happy ending. If the Maid itself was to experience some sort of major problem that would shut it down permanently, I entrust that that group knows how to set themselves into a cryosleep and maybe find a new home. They'll do the right thing. When, in fact, they had to move, there was a concern about storage, and I offered storage at the Internet Archive, but they ended up going with their own collection of storage. In other words, not only did they have a plan, but they had people willing to step forward for that plan. Contrast that with how the Living Computer Museum seems to be handling things, which is mostly to sell off the biggest and the most expensive parts, and then deal with what's left. And here I mention something which, to me, let's not call it a happy ending, but in talking with Stephen, I found out that the software that was donated, the documentation, the parts of the museum that are, let's say, unique, if you want to debate that, whether or not a joystick is unique versus the documents behind a user group or the floppy disks that were held by an old computer store are unique, the SDF is going to take control of a good portion of this, and they are going to digitize it and turn it digital, and the Internet Archive will be the ultimate physical repository and the digital repository for what comes out of that. Before you start your applause, let's just say this should have been obvious. This should have been something arranged years ago if it was going to be arranged. The Living Computer Museum, which had classrooms and displays and computers you could play with, had an incredible downstairs storage. One you could walk through and just be impressed with how many different teletypes and Macintoshes and microcomputers and parts from all these different pieces of computer history. And it feels like there was no long-term plan, at least not one that was written in stone anywhere. They just began cutting costs, getting rid of people, and then shuttering at the first opportunity. That's not a plan. That's a reaction. I think as I move on in life, I am becoming less and less enamored of don't cry that it's gone, smile because it happened. It's possible to smile that it happened and smile wider because you know what's planned for later. So right now, it's a series of cotton candy promises and me using what I have at my disposal to maybe cause some portions of the Living Computer Museum to persist. But I feel that the Living Computer Museum's legacy is a lesson. Money does not make you wise. Being part of history does not make you think about being part of history. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's worth parking illegally to run in to get the real story. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, Joey Mink, John JB.org Bailey, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have supported me and helped me get out of debt. All of these statements, who knows where they'll be when they finally come down into the world of reality. I hold things in my hand and consider that the news. I don't entirely buy into how well this is going to go, but you have my assurance I'm going to do the best on my side. And there are many other people who similarly make weird and perhaps foggy predictions about their own plans for their lives, and folks like me come along and scoop it up later. That's fine. It just feels like the billions with a B, could have been implemented with a scant more interest in the future.